Welcome to The Faithful Steward. This is a podcast all about sharing biblical wisdom and practical insights in order to help church leaders pursue and teach financial freedom as part of Christian discipleship. We believe this is a spiritual conversation, and this is a place where the church needs to lead the way in order to move our communities forward in how we steward God's resources. I'm your host, James Lenhoff, and I am so passionate about this conversation and helping leaders have the confidence to step into it. We believe that if we help people thrive financially and grow spiritually, it changes everything. And I am so excited to join you on this journey. This podcast is brought to you by Good Sense. If you'd like more information about what we're up to, you can go to our website at goodsensemovement.org. All right, let's get started with today's conversation. All right, so this is the last week of this 3-week series on marriage and money. And we started this topic around this idea that we need to move towards oneness, that we tend to approach this as mine and yours when you think in terms of ours. And then last week we talked about a lot of what gets in the way is what we bring into that oneness. There's a lot of dysfunction and brokenness and history and different views of how this should work based on our experiences and how we need to seek understanding in order to resolve those differences and decide how we're going to handle these things together so that we can aim at a common future. And that's the part I want to talk about today. How do we aim? How do we organize around this common shared set of priorities? How do we build out together this vision of what we want that makes sense to both of us and that we're both excited about and attracted to, so that we're willing to face the sacrifices that are necessary to get there, to do the work that is needed in order to accomplish these things? How do we frame that up? And that, I think, a lot of times is where these arguments end up falling apart. You know, we talked about this idea of the go and the woe, and that there's this sense of let's go spend the money and do the things, and let's, hoard and protect and make sure we have more than enough and are secure. And those are really rooted a lot of times in different motivations. Last week we talked about those different motivations. But at the end of the day, what that means is that those motivations prioritize things differently. And that's where we're mostly fighting about. We're fighting about the fact that I think that's a waste of money. Well, I think that's a waste of money because I don't see that as a priority, whatever that is. Maybe, for example, one spouse wants to redecorate the family room, and the other spouse says, well, who cares? We have a couch to sit on. That's not important to me. Well, it's important to the other person because they're motivated by love and devotion, and they want to be hospitable. They want to welcome people into a place that feels comfortable and beautiful and relaxing. And so the issue is not just that those motivations are different, it's that those motivations lead us to a conclusion that's different priorities. We land on different focuses, different things that we decide are important because we never really talked about what's important. And so we see that play out all the time. We'll see one spouse that is motivated by power, that wants to climb the corporate ladder and be really focused on getting the next promotion and getting the next status and the next raise. And that's such a huge priority for them. And it's in direct competition with the priority of the other spouse who wants family time and connection and doesn't actually care about status and title, is more interested in time and shared experience. And those things are in conflict. Our priorities being out of sync lead to a tremendous amount of conflict in marriage. What we need to do in order to chart a course that we're both excited about and we both agree on is have that conversation all the time. Setting this course is not something that you do once and then 30 years later it just happens. This is a constant revision and discussion and a lot of work to winnow away the stuff that's a distraction and remind yourselves what you've decided is important. We call that process the non-negotiables. And one of the things that I think is really valuable in our Freed Up app is we lead couples through a mindful exercise, almost like a prayer meditation, where we're asking questions about what matters so that they can compare notes. They can kind of distill down, these are the things that I think are most important, and let's look at what you came up with and decide where we overlap. See what does seem to fit together so that we can aim at that together. And we actually are going to put a link to that exercise in the show notes so that you can try it out as part of kind of the design of that app. We want to take things deeper in the spiritual, deeper into the heart condition and the spiritual condition that breaks and creates all of this dysfunction around stewardship. And part of that is rediscovering the things that are most important to us so that we can actually aim God's resources at accomplishing those things. And so what that may mean is that we have really differing priorities. But most of the time, we haven't faced the consequences of those priorities. We haven't wrestled to the ground that if we decide we want this thing, that means we can't have this other thing. So, for example, if we decide that we want our kids to go to private school, that means I have to go work a job that can make enough money to provide for that private school education, which means I'm probably traveling more, I'm gone more often. And so if the priority is family time and the priority is private education and the priority is career advancement, those priorities are in conflict, and we're going to have to wrestle to the ground. What do we want the most, and what consequences are we willing to accept? Most families just want all the things without thinking through what those things cost and what they have to put down in order to pick up these things that matter most. I think more often than not, that's where we see the resentment come in. When one of us is chasing a priority that's important to me, for example, and my wife is chasing a priority that's important to her, but we have not agreed that those priorities are important to us, we end up resenting the distraction that we feel like that is. If she's chasing something I'm not all that excited about or interested in, and I'm chasing something she's not excited about or interested in, we naturally get to a place of resenting the energy, the resources, the focus on that thing that I don't care about. When we come together and map out what we most care about for our experience as a family, then we are both excited about it, both interested in it, both want to aim resources at it. And what we recognize is the priorities that we have determined are most important mean that this other priority that's important to me has to go. But I'm willing to accept that consequence. I'm willing to put that thing down if that means I get to pick this more important thing up. That's the work. That's where a lot of that resentment falls away, because I understand why I'm putting it down. If I know I'm putting it down to pick up something that's even better, even more valuable to me, I'll put it down in a hot second. But if I don't have any understanding of why I can't do this thing I want, other than just because you want to do this thing you want, then we're just fighting over whose wants are more important, whose priorities take more precedent. And so this is the work. This is the charting the course, is us sitting down and saying, okay, when it comes to things like saving, what is a reasonable amount for us to have in security, an emergency fund? What do we need to be putting away in order to hit our goals? What is this shared agreed upon value that we decide is reasonable and worth it and is aiming at a target we both want? What about debt? What is our shared vision of how debt works and what we should have and what we shouldn't have? What do we need to do in order to get to a place where we both feel balance, security, confidence, because we have gotten to a place where that is under control? What about when we think about generosity? How much should we be giving? What are our priorities of what we give to? There's only so much to go around, and so we need to decide ahead of time. Our priority will always be these things we care most about in our giving, in our generosity. What about our family? What are the shared experiences that we care about the most that we want to make sure we always prioritize? And what does that mean? For example, if one of those things is we will always have dinner together, well, that means I can't take a traveling job because I can't be gone all the time if I'm going to be able to meet that expectation of that priority. That's how these trade-offs work. And it's a good thing. It's a healthy thing to wrestle those things to the ground. Because if we have fully embraced these priorities that we agree on around these different areas, if we look at our work-life balance and we say, this far, no further, and we decide we're going to establish, for example, a Sabbath rhythm where we have rest in our family, and so that means we don't do these other things. If we've agreed on why we're picking up what we care about, then putting down the things that are the consequence of that picking up becomes so much easier. For example, early on in our family, we decided that we were going to establish a Sabbath rhythm. And in that Sabbath rhythm, that means Saturday is our Sabbath. And if Saturday is our Sabbath, that means we're not going and doing 8 different sports teams that all play games on Saturdays. And so because we were discussing as a family that we're picking up this beautiful experience of rest and stillness and connection, we had to put down these other things that would distract us from that thing we all agree we want. That's a great example of good things that compete with each other and actually steal from us the priorities we care the most about. That's the kind of work we need to do as a family in order to winnow away the noise. We need to shrink down the list of things we care about the most, and then we need to acknowledge, if we pick this up, that means these things have to go. Are we all okay with that? Do we all agree that that's worth it? Because if we agree that the consequences of that priority are worth it, then every time we're forced to face the fact that we're saying no to these things, we can be reminded it's because we're saying yes to the stuff we've agreed is more important than this. We don't have to fight over it. We decided it ahead of time. We were intentional about it. There's a lot of work there, tons and tons of questions to answer. It will ultimately help us to focus, but will also leave us with the reality that we'll probably have more priorities than we have resources for. Even after we've done the winnowing, we're still going to have to put some things down in order to really make sure we maintain contentment and confidence and steadiness, that we're not running all the way up to the edge and constantly burning ourselves out and stressing ourselves out in anxiety because we're trying to spin all these plates that by definition we just don't have the time and the resources to spin. This is such a beautiful, valuable exercise that I think goes completely ignored by many, many families. And this is an opportunity for the church to step in and call people to a prayerful consideration of what they're choosing, instead of just kind of this emotional reaction to opportunities or marketing messages or keeping up with the Joneses kinds of pressure. We can actually step into a prayerful, thoughtful exercise that asks the question, what's important? And if we pick up those things that are important, what do we have to choose to let go of in order to make room for those things that we've chosen to pick up? It is such a powerful tool. But once we have delineated these are the things we're choosing, now by default, we are aiming at a shared vision. We've decided about the stuff that matters most, and so we can team up. We can look at that and say, let's get after it. Let's go for it. Let's reach for these things because we both want them. We find oneness in aiming at that future that we've decided we're excited about. we find oneness in recognizing that the consequences of the stuff that we put down are worth it. We're okay with those consequences. We've chosen those consequences rather than being forced upon us. That is the difference. All of these things start to change in their strain and their tendency towards conflict. If we've had all of this work ahead of time and we've decided, it's way easier to just remind ourselves this is what we picked, rather than arguing about it and why does it matter and why do we choose this over that. We've already done that work. One thing that is really important is that this is an ongoing dialogue with your family. Priorities change. We are going to experience different seasons in our life as a family. When we're a couple without kids, our priorities are going to be very different than when we have kids. And when those kids are little and they're all involved in different events and activities, versus when they're a little bit bigger and they get involved in sports. And then when they eventually go off to college, there's just different seasons where these priorities will naturally shift, and that's healthy. That's right. And we need to have this conversation all throughout those changes so that we keep choosing the things that matter the most and we keep putting down the things that would get in the way. This is a constant dialogue, at least once a year, if not more often. This is a conversation we should be having with our spouses, with our kids. We should be engaging in this discussion, and we should be teaching our churches to engage in these kinds of discussions as well. This is the work that aligns us. It aligns our hearts as faithful stewards with the owner of these resources. We want to honor him with what he's asked us to manage. It aligns our hearts with each other, with our family, with our kids. It helps them understand the trade-offs that we're choosing and why. And it grows us in our selflessness and in our sense of self-sacrifice because we're willing to put things down that we wanted because we see that we collectively want something that's way better. And we choose it intentionally, and we run after it together in unity. I think this is one of the most important tools for families to use to grow in their faithful stewardship and their unity in running after honoring God's kingdom with God's resources. Well, thank you so much for listening to the Faithful Steward podcast. Be sure to check out the show notes for links and other information that we mentioned in today's episode. Also, be sure to check out our website at goodsensemovement.org to get all the resources we offer churches to help equip them in teaching financial stewardship to their community. If you have any questions or any topics you want to make sure we cover on our show, you can email me at jameslenhoff@goodsensemovement.org. I'd love to hear from you. I hope you all have a great week. We'll talk to you next week.